Order. The sitting is resumed and we're going to consider the important subject of the closure of Soggets Lane level crossings in Cleethorpes, and I call on Martin Vickers to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Holloway. As always, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and, as you say, a very important subject. I move that this House has considered the closure of Soggets Lane level crossing in Cleethorpes. Mr Holloway, though this debate relates specifically to Soggets Lane crossing, it should be seen in the broader context of the accountability of Network Rail, a nationalised company who it seems on this issue are unaccountable to the Secretary of State of their sponsoring department. In theory, Network Rail can be held to account in a number of ways. The Office of Rail and Road monitors health and safety and has a role in determining the level of public funding that Network Rail receives, and that they also set certain objectives. Andrew Haynes, the company's chief executive, is personally accountable to Parliament for Network Rail's use of taxpayers' money, and the Secretary of State for Transport holds some power over the board's leadership and management of the business. But the accountability on more issues that can have significant impact on local communities seems totally absent. However, to be so independent, they are wholly unaccountable and free from adequate scrutiny on such matters as the Soggets Lane issue is clearly unacceptable. If Network Rail is able to dismiss the representations of local residents, councils, members of Parliament and even the Secretary of State himself, then it is surely time to revisit the present structures. This should not and cannot be allowed to continue. Until recently, this level crossing allowed hundreds of local residents every day to pass to the North Promenade of the East Coast's premier seaside resort, quickly and easily, without the hassle of a bridge. Let's just consider the figures. By Network Rail's own figures, 570 pedestrians and cyclists use the crossing each day. The figure will undoubtedly be higher at weekends and during holiday periods, but even assuming it's a constant 570, that's 208,050 per annum, and that equates to over 2 million in 10 years. And in 10 years, there have again, by Network Rail's figures, been just 15, yes, 15 near misses. Near misses has a specifically closely defined criteria. I'll return to these figures shortly. The proposed closure was first drawn to my attention with a letter from the Route Managing Director, Rob McIntosh, dated 3rd of January. Later that month, they wrote a similar letter to the then leader of North East Lincolnshire Council, Councillor Ray Oxby, to inform us that they had taken the decision to close the crossing. Not to consult about it, the decision to close the crossing. This decision was made prior to any consultation with the local residents, the council, or myself. In that letter, the Route Managing Director either exaggerated the case or was ill-informed when he stated that the crossing was very dangerous and outlining that over 50 freight and passenger trains traverse the crossing every day at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. Remember the figure of 15 near misses in the last 10 years. Does that really qualify for the description very dangerous? For the record, there are 3 trains per hour, Mondays to Friday, 1 in each direction on the Manchester service and the 2-hourly service to Barton-on-Humber. In other words, 3 trains an hour for almost every hour of the weekday. On Saturdays, there are 6 extra movements with services over to Sheffield via the Brigg and Gainsborough route. Incidentally, 4 years ago, a new footbridge was erected at Brigg Station. This no doubt improved facilities for a handful of passengers on each Saturday. But I have to say the logic of spending thousands on the project is at the very least another example of questionable priorities by Network Rail. As for the freight trains travelling at 60 miles an hour, not a single freight train is in operation on that part of the line. In reality, trains are reducing speed on their approach to the station. Immediately after passing the level crossing, the speed limit falls to 30 miles per hour. Why not reduce the speed before the level crossing? Those trains leaving the station do not have time to gain a high speed. And anyway, why not allow them to travel slowly at, say, 20, 25 miles an hour until they have crossed Soggets Lane, which is only about a quarter of a mile away? I raised these discrepancies with Network Rail representatives in a face-to-face meeting in March, but these matters seemed to be of little concern to them. In fact, their representative was very forward in telling me that given the opportunity, they would quite happily close every level crossing in the country. A laudable but wholly unachievable aim. Unfortunately, though, the crossing has been in constant use by members of the public for 150 years, but does not seem to have established a right-of-way. So Network Rail have been able to close it. They highlighted an existing pedestrian bridge a little down the line at Fuller Street, which they argued was a suitable alternative for local residents. Suitable certainly for the able-bodied, but not so for the disabled and for those with prams and the like. If it did occur to Network Rail, and I'm sure it did, that this bridge somewhere down the line would pose a great inconvenience for local residents, they chose to dismiss the issue. It is this issue, the lack of disabled access, that has been the concern most frequently raised with me by constituents over recent weeks. Over the last few months, I've been in frequent contact with Network Rail through written letters, face-to-face meetings. However, no progress has been made. During the course of the last couple of months, I have raised the matter in the House on 5 previous occasions and have secured the support of the Rail Minister, who is present here today, who asked Network Rail to review their decision. And along with my honourable friend, the Minister, I met representatives of Network Rail on Monday, the 8th of April, to further make the case. They agreed to consider the suggestion of reopening the crossing whilst they review their plans. I also presented a petition to the House organised by the Cleethorpes-based DN35 Crime Watch and signed by over 4,000 local residents who are opposed to the closure. Late in April, I had the opportunity of making representations directly to Andrew Haynes, the Chief Executive of Network Rail. I pressed him on the situation and argued that at the very least, the crossing could be reopened whilst a review takes place. He promised that he would personally look into the issue, and he duly did and wrote to me saying no change. Within a matter of weeks, or days even, I discovered that Network Rail had erected a permanent barrier at the crossing to make it impossible for pedestrians to cross. Clearly, they did not consider the recommendation of reopening very seriously or in any great detail. The response from Network Rail to date has been disappointing, but I remain committed to the campaign and will continue to support local residents, who I'm glad to see have come along today, to support them in their objections to this heavy-handed and ill-advised decision. According to Robert Wainwright, head of level crossings at Network Rail, the UK actually has one of the best level crossing safety records in Europe. This is especially remarkable as our country has one of the most intensively used rail systems in the world. 5 years ago, the Transport Select Committee produced a report on level crossing safety. I was a member of the committee at that time, Mr Hollowone, and I draw yours and the House's attention to 2 of their recommendations. One was that we recommend that Network Rail address the criticism of its apparent preference for footbridges as replacements for level crossings and explain what assessment it makes of the impact on disabled people of replacing crossings with footbridges rather than underpasses. They also said, we are concerned that the proposed appeal mechanism for closure orders, including judicial review, will be out of reach for ordinary people and increasingly for local authorities. We recommend that DfT consider using alternative dispute resolutions, such as mediation by the Office of the Rail Regulator. I'll happily give way to my honourable friend and neighbour.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Within the conclusions and recommendations of that report of which he was a part, didn't it also say that, that there was a merit considered by the committee in applying a public safety test to any diversionary routes that then may result from a level crossing a closure? And is he aware of whether Network Rail have actually undertaken that recommendation in this situation?
I certainly recall the point that my honourable friend makes. And I have to confess, I don't know whether that has been followed through, whether the Minister is able to confirm that. We wait and see. I understand that for the last decade, Network Rail have made a great deal of effort to improve the safety of level crossings. Initiatives like the introduction of level crossing managers and ever-improving technology has proven to be a success in changing and improving behaviour at level crossings. From a practical perspective, technology is probably the most effective means of changing outcomes. It is a huge factor in the reduction of deliberate misuse and human errors across the country. I see no reason why Network Rail could not implement technology in order to aid pedestrian decision-making at Suggett's Lane, perhaps with the use of supplementary audible warnings and overlay miniature stoplight solutions. In September 2013, the Law Commission published a report and a draft bill which made a series of recommendations that aimed to improve the safety and regulation of level crossings. Some of the suggestions included providing tools to support health and safety regulations, including level crossing plans, enforceable agreements between rail operators and other duty holders, and a power for the Secretary of State to issue directions if necessary. If properly implemented, these proposals have the potential to make level crossings much safer so that Network Rail feel less incentivised to close them on a whim. Clearly, there are a vast number of alternatives available to Network Rail rather than closure. I have no doubt in my mind that this decision was taken as it was the easiest and cheapest option. There was no need for Network Rail to take into consideration the trouble this would cause for the elderly and disabled residents, given the lack of powers any person or institution has to hold them to account. This is unacceptable and must change. Suggestions that a modern footbridge could be installed at Fuller Street with disabled access would prove extremely expensive. And whether that funding were to come from the owners of the bridge, North East Lincolnshire Council, or from Network Rail, it would be public money. But I would question whether public money should be spent on eliminating a theoretical risk at Suggett's Lane when there are hundreds, indeed thousands, of level crossings, many with trains passing at 125 miles an hour, where the money could be better spent. I referred earlier to the 15 near misses that Network Rail referred to. Let's remember 15 near misses in 10 years, during which time in excess of 2 million people will have passed over the crossing. On the 9th of April, Mr Ian Stewart from the Rail Accident Investigation Branch emailed one of the local campaigners, Lynn Sales, and he said, "We have reviewed our records from when we were established in October 2005 and have found details of only one incident at Suggett's Lane level crossing, which occurred on the 13th of January 2011. The circumstances of this particular case were unclear, but involved an individual being found with an injury in the vicinity of the crossing. However, there was no direct evidence that the injury had actually been caused by a train. The RAIB received no formal notification from the industry about the accident, and the circumstances could not be substantiated, so no further action was taken." So, out of the 15 near misses, only one was considered significant enough to involve the RAIB. One near miss where the circumstances could not be substantiated when set against in excess of 2 million crossings. It becomes a massive 2 million crossings. Why close and cause massive inconvenience based on those results? Of course, people should not trespass on the railway. Of course, people should not act foolishly, but sadly, some do. We all suffer to some extent as a result. But in this instance, the massive inconvenience being caused is quite simply not justified. If anyone is determined to trespass on that stretch of railway, they can go along to Cleethorpes railway station any time of the day or night, wander down the platform and onto the track. I urge Network Rail to do the right thing, admit they have not fully appreciated the strength of local feeling, that full, proper and meaningful consultations should take place. And whilst those discussions take place, they should reopen Suggett's Lane crossing. And my plea to the Minister is that he uses his good offices to find a solution. Thank you, Mr Hollowbone.